The most brutal twist, nobody really won. Leona thought she played the perfect revenge game. Expose the affair, crush the kingpin, walk out with her spine unbroken. Garrett thought he played the perfect sacrifice. Make her hate him, cut her loose, keep her safe. But here's the killer part. Both of them were right and both of them were catastrophically wrong. She became the perfect weapon and fired at the wrong man. He became the perfect protector and never told her she was the one he was dying for. That is why this story hurts. Not because love ended, but because silence beat love to the trigger.
And just like that, the documents landed on the table. A final verdict with no need for explanation. Across the island, Leona Calloway, the very subject of this hostile acquisition, was a study in glacial composure. She observed their entrance. Garrett, the architect of her ruin, making a grand show of adjusting a cufflink. Flanking him was Monique Voss, a human victory banner poured into a scarlet dress. As Monique's gaze devoured the penthouse, Leona's eyes merely drifted from Garrett to Monique before settling on the papers. Only after a deliberate wipe of her hands did she approach the table. A quiet act of defiance. The room held an oppressive quiet, punctuated only by the city's low thrum and the mournful cry of a distant Chicago siren. Her expression was a perfect mask as she read, denying them the spectacle of her collapse. Garrett simply watched, anticipating the emotional implosion he had engineered. Monique was electric with a predator's thrill. Yet Leona merely slid the papers back, her hand so steady it was not a surrender but an opening move. A slow, knowing smile then bloomed on her face, not to conceal her pain, but to declare its end. The gesture shattered the confidence of Garrett and Monique. You could practically see their arrogance crumble, and this was their critical error. They profoundly misjudged the woman forged in the fires of the last 18 months. They saw the wife they once knew, utterly oblivious to the warrior who stood before them. It wasn't merely a betrayal, it was a catastrophic miscalculation in a war they were both losing. The final act of this tragedy has yet to unfold. But this is not their story alone. You can feel its echoes everywhere. On a crowded train, in the quiet solitude of a late-night dorm room. It is a singular narrative, playing out across millions of lives, each one a testament to the same bitter truth. If these journeys into the human soul resonate with you, subscribe for more. Your presence helps us reach others who might see their own reflection in this struggle and, perhaps, find a way to break the pattern. Now, let us return to the beginning, to Garrett Calloway's first encounter with a girl from the South Side. Leona Marsh's chronicle begins in a third-floor apartment on Chicago's South Side, a place that felt steeped in anonymity. Her father, Raymond Marsh, a welder by trade, was the source of her first profound trauma. His sudden, violent death when she was 9 years old, claimed by his work with fire and steel, left an indelible scar. She recalled his calloused, powerful hands and the quiet dignity he possessed. His loss created a void that nearly consumed the family. But her mother, Dorothy Marsh, was the anchor that held them fast. Most people knew her simply as Dot. She was a diminutive woman with an immense capacity for endurance. A seamstress, her existence was a relentless cycle of labor. Her days began at 4 a.m, a schedule dictated by necessity, not by choice. When Leona turned 13, a deep weariness settled into Dot's bones, a pain she would only succumb to after 8 each evening. Dot's lessons were lived, not spoken: how to persevere, how to carry one's burdens, and how to maintain grace amid chaos. She always concealed her own anxieties, particularly when their finances grew thin. At 14, following a classmate's cruel remark about her poverty, Leona received the wisdom that would become her creed. Her mother explained with a quiet intensity that silence is not weakness. Sometimes stillness is the ultimate expression of power. The most formidable person in any room, Dot imparted, is the one who moves unseen. This philosophy became Leona's guiding principle, a reason to master her own emotions. It was her armor. The cost of college made it an impossible dream, a reality that set her on an entirely different course. Leona possessed an innate, almost spiritual gift for perceiving the hidden harmony and potential in any space. She became a self-taught designer, absorbing knowledge from public library books and applying it to neighborhood projects on shoestring budgets. These early endeavors were a testament to her burgeoning brilliance. She grasped a fundamental tenet of style. True elegance is born from intention and care, not from a price tag. By 23, Leona Marsh had no capital but was rich in pure resolve, still residing with her mother. This fortitude was her inheritance, forged by those 4 a.m. awakenings and Dot's doctrine of quiet strength. This resilient core was precisely what Patricia Calloway would later recognize at the engagement party, making an observation that would become a pivotal moment in the Calloway family saga. But that chapter of the story will come later. Garrett Calloway was not the architect of an empire, but its heir, and in the unforgiving landscape of Chicago, that distinction is everything. His father, Thomas Calloway, had erected their dynasty in the 1990s, expanding from a single restaurant into a network of legitimate enterprises. The illicit heart of their operation remained a closely guarded secret. A decade ago, Thomas Calloway was assassinated, a hit that street lore attributed to the rival Voss family. Garrett was 27 when his father was brutally taken from him. Upon receiving the news, his response was not sorrow, but a chilling, almost preternatural composure. His first command was to dispatch his brother, Shaw, to secure their mother's safety. In that instant, the mantle of his father settled upon his shoulders. Now, 10 years on, at 37, Garrett Calloway's name commands both fear and deference across Chicago. He has since doubled the family's assets, overseeing all their ventures, both legitimate and otherwise. Their illicit affairs were a matter of oral tradition, a rule his legal counsel upheld as scripture. Garrett's authority stemmed not from overt threats, but from silent, irreversible actions that required no encore. From the family estate in Lincoln Park, his mother, Patricia Calloway, now 63, observed all. As the kingpin's widow, she was the family's quiet regent. Patricia governed not with force, but with subtle cues, a glance, a pause, the delicate click of her teacup that could chill a person to the bone. Following her husband's lengthy decline and eventual passing, Patricia had single-handedly forged her sons. Shaw, 4 years Garrett's junior at 33, managed their legitimate corporations with understated competence and absolute devotion. The collision of Garrett and Leona's worlds occurred 4 years before the divorce filings, within a small West Loop art gallery. He was not there to appreciate art. The gallery served as a convenient front to cleanse illicit funds. He never even registered the art. His focus was entirely captured by her. She was wrestling with a large canvas, her pride a barrier against seeking assistance. He observed her for 5 full minutes before she finally acknowledged his stare. She met his gaze without a flicker of intimidation. She simply stated, "You're ahead of schedule. The exhibition begins at 6 o'clock. Her direct, unadorned words rendered him speechless, a rare occurrence for Garrett Calloway. On the surface, they were worlds apart, separated by an abyss of class and capital. She hailed from the industrial South Side. He was the scion of a criminal dynasty. But in Leona, Garrett perceived something absent in his own world, an authentic strength, a self-assurance not built upon the foundation of fear. 8 months later, they were betrothed. At the celebration, his mother, Patricia, assessed Leona with a clinical eye and delivered a cryptic admonition. "Do not you dare shatter it!" Garrett dismissed his mother's comment as mere theatrics. Yet the expression on Shaw's face suggested a deeper meaning. Garrett would later recall that warning as a prophecy of terrifying accuracy. Their 4 years together became Leona's gilded cage, a penthouse overlooking the city, a home she designed herself, but from which she could never truly leave. Leona had molded the cold, modern space into a sanctuary that left every visitor momentarily speechless with reverence. Her sole design objective was to forge a genuine home, not merely a museum of affluence. Even her husband's most hardened associates were consistently awed into silence upon entering. This unspoken respect was the only validation Leona ever received, a quiet acknowledgement of her dominion over this small kingdom. For the entirety of their 4-year marriage, mastery over aesthetics was the solitary domain Leona controlled. Every other liberty was quietly and methodically eroded. It began in the first year with her resignation from her job, a move framed as a safety measure to which she acquiesced. By the second year, bodyguards became her constant shadows, transforming simple outings into highly orchestrated events. Her world began to contract, a process that unfolded without a single overt order from him. Her social circle dissolved as acquaintances retreated from the ambient danger surrounding her husband. Only one friend, Nell Tucker, remained, but their meetings felt shadowed and observed. Even Leona's mother, Dot Marsh, was gently dissuaded from visiting by a polite word from her husband's enforcer, Perry Hayes, who cited vague security concerns. The message implied that Mrs. Marsh should telephone her daughter instead. Leona understood the subtext perfectly. The walls of her confinement were now absolute. Yet the most agonizing part of her ordeal was not the isolation, but a profound and hollow ache within. Their efforts to conceive a child in the first year had been fruitless. A cycle of IVF at an impersonal Streeterville clinic also ended in heartbreak. That initial IVF failure plunged her into a 3-day abyss from which no amount of willpower could pull her. 6 months on, a second attempt ignited a fragile hope that burned for 7 weeks before being brutally extinguished. As she lost the pregnancy, her consciousness fractured, fixating on the sterile gleam of a countertop she had chosen. Then, the third and final loss, 9 months before the confrontation, forced the realization that her perfectly designed home was, in fact, the most desolate place on earth. And as for her husband's part in this private tragedy, he simply vanished. Where comfort should have been, he offered only absence, carving a silent, ever-widening chasm between them. The apartment, once her sanctuary and crowning achievement, now felt like a pristine tomb, its perfect walls closing in, stealing the very oxygen from her lungs. Their marriage was not merely failing, it was being meticulously poisoned from the inside. The betrayal began with the smallest of tells, the way his phone now rested face down on every surface, a small, dark shield guarding a hidden world. Leona noted it without a sound, another piece of evidence for the prosecution she was building in her mind. This simple act was the first tremor before the quake, a quiet signal of the mounting deception. Soon after, his arrival home from work began to drift later and later into the darkness. 10 o'clock stretched into 10:30, then bled past 11, each excuse thinner than the one before. A new pattern emerged, calls taken out on the balcony, his back turned to her, followed by a silent return with no explanation. She detected a new fragrance on him, too. It was sharper, a deliberately chosen scent, the kind a man wears to construct a new version of himself for someone else. Leona first registered this alien aroma on a Friday night. When she finally inquired about it, her question was not one of a lover, but of a forensic investigator. That scent was a hostile organism introduced into the delicate ecosystem of their marriage. He had also ceased asking about her life, her work. The death of that simple curiosity stung more deeply than any overt act of cruelty. That silence was the final mortal wound. The gentle rhythm of their shared evenings was gone, replaced by a dense, suffocating stillness. Every ounce of warmth had been siphoned from their home. After dinner, Garrett would either retreat to his study, leave the apartment altogether, or sit on the sofa cloaked in an emotional distance as impenetrable as stone. His body was present, but his spirit was gone. A hollow space that felt more vacant than if he were 1,000 miles away. The first tangible proof was not a confession or a careless message. She found it folded neatly inside a charcoal vest she was preparing for the dry cleaner that Monday. It was a receipt from the Peninsula Chicago for a 2-night stay, complete with room service for 2, dated the very weekend Garrett was supposedly in Miami for business. There, in their dressing room, Leona read the receipt twice, a cold, methodical verification, not from disbelief, but to ensure her analysis was unequivocally correct. She then sat on the edge of their bed, the slip of paper resting on her lap, and remained utterly motionless for 20 minutes. There were no tears, no trembling hands, no surge of grief. She processed the information as a patient accepts a terminal diagnosis, absorbing the truth, assessing the damage, and triaging what was lost from what must be saved. In that profound quiet, Leona was not thinking of Garrett. She was thinking of Dot. She saw her mother standing tall in the sewing shop at 4 a.m. With swollen ankles and a will of iron, Dot simply worked until the war was won. Leona imagined what her mother would do, cornered in a closet larger than their entire childhood home. Dot would never grant an enemy the satisfaction of watching her break. Leona refolded the receipt along its original creases, slid it back into the vest pocket, and placed the garment back on its hanger, smoothing fabric before turning away. In the kitchen, she began to prepare dinner. Her hands did not shake. Her posture was erect. Dot Marsh's daughter would not be undone by a piece of paper. 3 weeks later, an invitation for lunch came from Nell Tucker. Nell, the 29-year-old owner of a Wicker Park flower shop, wore her hair in a careless knot, her hands telling stories of thorns and wire. She was the final living artifact of Leona's former life, a connection Garrett's security detail had completely overlooked, assuming a simple florist posed zero risk. They met at their usual cafe, by the window. This time, however, a nervous energy radiated from Nell. Her hands fussed with the silverware, arranging and rearranging it. For the first 10 minutes, she filled the air with talk of the weather, a wedding she was working on, the rising cost of peonies. Leona simply listened, recognizing the static before a momentous transmission. Leona had endured enough loaded silences to recognize the prelude to a difficult truth. At last, Nell stilled her hands, lacing her fingers together on the tabletop. Her gaze fell as she admitted quietly that she had seen Garrett. He was with another woman at the bar in the Peninsula just last week. The way they were together, she added, it left nothing to interpretation. Having delivered the devastating news, Nell fell silent. When she finally met Leona's eyes, they were filled with a strange, reflected shame. Not guilt, but the awful, secondhand mortification of the messenger. This was the kind of truth no one ever wishes to speak, and no one ever wishes to hear. Nell had obviously rehearsed this moment, but there is no gentle way to detonate a life. Leona just watched her, her expression unreadable. She did not flinch. She did not gasp. She simply reached across the table and placed her hand over Nell's. A brief, firm gesture that conveyed everything. "Thank you for telling me," Leona said, her voice perfectly level. "And if you see it again, I need you to tell me again." Nell was stunned into silence for a full 3 seconds. She had braced for tears, for hysterics, for the complete emotional collapse one would expect. What she received was a calm, clear directive from a woman sitting perfectly straight, her eyes clear as glass. Nell's mouth hung open for a moment before she closed it and nodded. They ordered their food and spoke of peonies and weddings as if nothing had happened, the name of the hotel never crossing their lips again. That night, with the kitchen immaculate and Garrett on the sofa, his phone in its customary face-down position, Leona went into the guest room, shut the door, sat on the bed, and dialed Frederick Harmon. Fritz Harmon, her lawyer for the last 3 years, was a 50-year-old man whose greatest asset was not his legal mind, but his intuitive grasp that for people like Leona, privacy was not a luxury but a lifeline. The call with Fritz lasted 40 minutes. Leona's voice remained steady. She posed a series of precise questions, noting his answers in a small leather-bound notebook from her bedside table, a book Garrett had never once opened, his curiosity about her inner world having died long ago. After the call, Leona sat for another 5 minutes, not to collect her emotions, but to finalize her strategy. The plan solidified at the moment she stood, walked out the door, and moved past Garrett's inert form on the sofa without a single glance. Her movement was silent, devoid of drama. It was simply a person rising to begin a war. Fritz Harmon operated out of a discreet office on the 6th floor of a building on LaSalle Street. There was no opulent sign, no receptionist, just a dark wood door with his name in small gold letters. At 50, with sharp silver hair and a uniform of crisp white shirts, he would allow a full 10 seconds of silence to pass after a client spoke before offering his reply. This was not a sign of slowness, but of a man who measured the necessity of every single word. In the 3 years he had handled Leona's design firm, not a single document had ever been leaked. No number miscalculated, no message lost. Leona had retained him for his impenetrable discretion, not his public acclaim. In the week following her late-night call, Leona visited Fritz's office twice. She arranged both meetings for the afternoon, coinciding with Garrett's supposed out-of-town trips. Arriving each time in an anonymous taxi, each visit was contained to less than an hour. She brought the small leather notebook, now filled with a list of questions in a tight, meticulous hand. Each query was a surgical probe aimed at a specific vulnerability in the financial empire she and Garrett had built together. Fritz listened, nodded, and provided answers, never once asking about her motive. His experience had taught him that when a wife arrives with a list of questions about joint assets, and her eyes are completely dry, the backstory is already understood. Leona's plan was simple in its design, but would demand extraordinary patience in its execution. Fritz confirmed that her interior design company, established before the marriage under her maiden name, Leona Marsh, was legally shielded from their marital finances. She would not touch it. But the joint accounts, the commingled investment portfolios, the 2 properties held in both their names. Those she began to methodically dismantle. The operation was slow, meticulously legal, and conducted one transaction at a time, each transfer calibrated to be small enough to avoid triggering automated alerts for Garrett or his financial advisors. Fritz monitored every move. Every transfer was documented. Every exchange was assigned a plausible justification. Nothing was suspect, nothing was rushed, and nothing left an obvious digital trail. Leona was extracting her capital from Garrett's world with the quiet, inexorable force of a glacier, exploiting every weakness with surgical precision. And then she uncovered what Fritz termed a significant complication, a discovery Leona met with such unnerving calm that it forced Fritz to reevaluate the true depth of her resolve. The Lincoln Park property, an asset Garrett co-owned and had pitched to her as a long-term investment, was secretly leveraged against a substantial loan he had secured without her knowledge. Worse, her signature appeared in the co-signer documents, papers Leona had never signed, never seen, never even been told existed. Her name had been forged on a debt against an asset she effectively did not know they had. The only person with the access and motive to orchestrate such a fraud was Garrett himself. With no word spoken, Fritz pushed the file across the desk to Leona, opened to the signature page. For 15 seconds, her gaze traced the ink. The forgery was expert, but the last stroke of her name felt wrong. It was a visceral feeling, born from signing her name countless times. She knew the motion of her own hand. That was not her writing. The file went home in her purse, and late that night, long after Garrett slept, the kitchen table became her command center, the pages illuminated until almost 2 a.m. If there was rage, it lay buried beneath an ocean of calm. She examined every page, every clause, every digit. Then, using the printer in Garrett's study, she duplicated the entire document, sealing the copy inside a plain envelope. It was hidden in a guest room suitcase. The original returned to its place before she went to sleep. She initiated no arguments with Garrett. She made no frantic calls to Fritz. She simply filed away another piece of intelligence for the masterwork she was constructing while maintaining her vigil. At home, their life was pure theater. Both were actors, but only Leona knew the curtain was about to fall. She prepared his meals, set the table, and stood at his side at gala, draped in stunning gowns, shaking the right hands, offering the right smiles, and speaking the right words. She was the perfect archetype of a crime lord's wife, composed, loyal, and knowing her place. And Garrett, witnessing that calm, mistook it for weakness. He interpreted her silence as compliance. He would look at the woman opposite him and see a partner kept completely in the dark. He had forgotten her origins. It never occurred to him what quiet people do when given enough time and a powerful reason. They prepare. Monique Voss did not simply drift into Garrett Calloway's orbit. She engineered her arrival with the patience of a hunter who knows the most precious targets are never exposed. They are stalked. At 30, she was the sole inheritor of Conrad Voss, leader of the Voss family and a sworn enemy of the Calloways, since Thomas Calloway's death in a parking garage a decade prior. Monique was raised on New York's Upper East Side, in a home whose monthly rent on a Central Park view surpassed what most families earned in a year. At 14, she was sent to an elite English boarding school. Her father's motive was not a superior education, but the creation of an ocean's worth of distance between his daughter and his illicit wealth. She returned to the States holding a business degree, a hybrid New York European accent, and an innate predatory grasp of power. She had absorbed it at her father's table, where empires were decided on cocktail napkins and men could be erased for a single wrong word. Monique's world intersected with Garrett's at a charity function in downtown Chicago. It was the annual spectacle where the city's elite and its criminal underworld mingled in one vast ballroom, under the same chandeliers, clutching the same untouched glasses of wine, everyone assessing everyone else. Garrett was the keynote speaker, commanding the podium in a black suit, his deep, unwavering voice compelling the room to lean in. It wasn't that he was quiet, but his words carried a weight that made you terrified to miss one. Monique was seated in the third row. She had already performed a deep analysis of Garrett. She had deconstructed the Callaway Syndicate, its corporate structure, its real estate, both the public records and the back alley whispers. She had researched Leona, their union, their childlessness. She was not the kind of combatant to step onto a battlefield without full reconnaissance. Garrett was ensnared. He convinced himself his interest was purely professional. He framed their dinners as strategic networking. He dismissed the hotel trysts as mere chemistry and good fortune, not as a carefully executed assault. Men who build kingdoms are often masters of self-deception. It is the very skill that allows their ascent. What Garrett failed to grasp about Monique, or perhaps chose to ignore, was that she would not be kept a secret. She had watched far too many women in that very role fade to nothing. She desired the home, the influence, the entire empire, and she regarded Leona not as a foe, but as a temporary occupant. She began to manipulate Garrett's psyche with surgical expertise. She never disparaged Leona directly, as that would have activated Garrett's residual protective instincts. Instead, she planted quiet, patient, and flawlessly aimed suggestions. "She still operates on a smaller scale," Monique would whisper, beside Garrett in hotel rooms that smelled of cold air and forgotten meals. "I don't say it to be cruel, but you have evolved beyond that. She remains where she was, and ambition and comfort cannot coexist for long." She never suggested Leona was less than him. She implied Garrett was more, a far more devastating strategy. Garrett, shaped by his mother's hardships, harbored a profound, unspoken fear of being outpaced by a changing world. Monique detected this weakness in their first month and methodically nurtured it every week. Through all of this, Leona was observing everything. In the 16th month of her clandestine planning, soon after a receipt from the peninsula verified her theories, Leona possessed all she required: the full name, the affiliated company, the address, the social media profiles, and a photograph that Nell confirmed for her with a single silent query that needed no words. For a long moment, Leona studied Monique's photo on her phone, her expression not of anger, but of cold, hard assessment. She identified the type on sight, not overtly evil, but brutally pragmatic, a woman who defined her worth by what she could possess. Then a greater realization dawned, making her set the phone down to watch the Chicago skyline dissolve into dusk. Monique was Conrad Voss's daughter. This meant the conflict was far larger than an affair, clandestine meetings, or the faint trace of perfume. It was a hostile takeover, and Leona, the daughter of Dot Marsh, the quiet woman no one ever noticed, knew she wasn't merely preparing for a divorce. She was preparing her escape from a war where she had been designated the first casualty. The narrative now returns to that Tuesday in the Gold Coast penthouse, following the smile that disarmed both Garrett and Monique. Leona's hands were flat on the table, the divorce documents forming a stark line between them. The smile lingered, but it had altered. It was no longer a mask for control, but a declaration of readiness, the expression of someone who has waited their entire life to speak, and their moment has arrived. Her eyes locked on Garrett. I anticipated this. I needed you to do this while she was present, because I required a witness. Her gaze snapped to Monique on the final word, and for the first time, Monique's confident facade began to splinter. Leona moved to the kitchen island, opened the third drawer, the one for oven mitts and dish towels. From beneath the contents, she retrieved a plain manila folder Garrett had never seen, for he had never once thought to look inside a kitchen drawer. She placed it beside his own legal papers and opened it. Inside were immaculately printed records, color-coded and arranged by date. Logs of money transfers, property deeds, notices of asset sales, and withdrawal receipts. 18 months of Leona's silent war were documented within that one folder. And so it was. Move by move, deal by deal, she orchestrated every play in total silence, completely invisible to the man who ran half of Chicago, but could not govern his own wife. I filed for divorce 3 weeks ago, Leona said evenly. My terms, my lawyer holds them, which makes your papers effectively worthless. Garrett's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Leona leafed through the pages, her tone as detached as if ordering food. The Gold Coast residence was put in my name alone 14 days ago, all legally signed and executed. Their joint venture was liquidated back in January. Her capital, a firm 58% of the total, was wired to her private accounts. The shared account they held was subsequently closed. Her money was shielded. His was not. Nothing was taken illegally. A hush fell, not for a lack of things to say, but to let the crushing weight of the next blow land. A comprehensive report on the forged signature for the Lincoln Park loan has been delivered, Leona stated, her voice steady as the room's atmosphere solidified. And not to the police. She stared Garrett down, unblinking. It went to your partners, and to your mother. The quiet that followed was more thunderous than any sound in that skyscraper. It simply absorbed every noise, especially any defense Garrett was scrambling to invent. Monique looked at Garrett, and for the first time, her flawless composure suffered a fatal crack. You forged a signature, Monique breathed, the sentence left hanging in the air. Correct, Leona affirmed with the cold, impersonal manner of someone tracking a shipment. Garrett's entire aura of authority just disintegrated. The cool, calculated confidence of a Chicago kingpin. It was gone. All that remained was raw panic, the look of a chess master checkmated by his own reckless move. He attempted to speak. Leona, just let me explain. She cut him off, not by raising her voice, but with a silence that was far more severe. I am listening. I have been listening for 2 years. That is how I know everything. She arranged both sets of documents on the table, like 2 different charts detailing the same terminal disease. Your mother phoned this morning, Leona stated. It wasn't about my file. She heard the rumors. The source is irrelevant. The point is, your partners will know the entire story by dawn. Garrett lurched, trying to reclaim some power. Leona simply retreated, a perfect step back, keeping him at bay. Business is business, she said, wielding the same justification he had used on her countless times. Sentiment is a liability. I have documentation for everything. Monique placed her purse on the table, as if anchoring herself. What is the next move? She asked, her voice low. Leona's gaze met hers, not with anger, but with the deep exhaustion of someone who has finally solved a long, twisted puzzle. Now, she discovers the true cost of this little acquisition, Leona answered. She took her keys, completely resigned to this moment. The man really believed he was being clever. He was utterly unaware she had secured her victory 18 months ago. She smoothed the fabric of her blouse. "I will be at my mother's," she said, into the void between them. "The key is in the usual place. I have what I need." She strode to the door and opened it to the flat afternoon glare. Leona's exit was clean. Behind her, Garrett Calloway stood like a statue in his own house, holding worthless papers, marooned in the beautiful vacant life he imagined he commanded. 3 days after Leona departed, Shaw Calloway drove to his mother's house. The 40-minute journey passed in absolute silence. No music, no phone calls, only him sorting through the ruins in his mind. Garrett had called the night prior, a talk that left Shaw stunned for a full 10 minutes. Garrett told the familiar tale of the victim, assigning blame to anyone but himself. Leona was unfeeling. Leona had abandoned him. Leona couldn't handle his world. He even presented his affair with Monique as an inescapable fate. It was just meant to be, Shaw. Shaw allowed him to ramble, merely listening as his brother constructed a fortress of deceit. Once Garrett finished, Shaw countered with one sharp inquiry. "Does Mom know about the signature?" A pause. "She knows a version of it," Garrett conceded. "I am seeing her tomorrow," Shaw stated, then terminated the call. When he got there, Patricia Calloway was in her customary living room chair, her post for 2 decades. She sat perfectly erect, hands on a Bible, gazing into nothingness. She was likely looking inward to a realm only mothers can enter, a place where sorrow is not an emotion, but a gravitational pull that draws all things to its heavy, dark core. Shaw closed the door. Her head snapped toward him. "Shut that door," she commanded, though he already had. He understood her meaning. He took the seat opposite her. Bypassing all pleasantries, she went straight for the heart of the matter. "This business with the signature, is it true?" It was not a question. It was a demand for confirmation of a terrible fact. She had already surmised the truth. She only needed to hear it aloud. Shaw offered a slow, deliberate nod. Patricia shut the Bible, placing it aside as if clearing space for something profane. "I chose Leona," she said. "I told him as much at their engagement. I saw her strength. He has disgraced us." Her tone was level, and its cold finality was far worse than any scream. The disgrace was not the affair. Men have their weaknesses, but the forgery, to steal from his own wife, from his own blood. A profound silence filled the room. The massive annual charity ball was that weekend. At a lavish hotel where fortunes are made and reputations are broken over cocktails. And who should appear but Garrett with Monique? This was his most grievous error, not just her presence, but her presence here, on his mother's territory. Their encounter was not by chance, it was an inevitability. The instant Patricia saw Monique beside Garrett, her expression hardened into a mask of pure judgment. It was a look of complete condemnation, one Shaw recognized from a lifetime of witnessing it. The expression she saved for when someone had crossed a final, unforgivable line. Shaw touched his mother's arm. It was like touching granite. Across the ballroom, Garrett saw her, and the color fled his face. He began to walk her way, pulling Monique with him, a sinner approaching the confessional. "Mom, please don't," he begged under his breath, aware of how futile it was. The conversations nearby died out, carving a pocket of silence before the blast. You brought her to my space. Patricia's voice was a whisper. To this function before these people, while your wife's name is still attached to your fraudulent papers. Mom, I am pleading with you. Not here. Then where is the proper venue? Her voice was unwavering, but each word landed like a blow. In the home you no longer possess? With the funds you no longer have? Monique was frozen. Patricia's eyes swept over her, not with rage, but with the tragic pity of a mother observing her son's living ruin. She clutched her purse. I am leaving. You will not bring this woman to my home. And do not call me to smooth things over with your partners. This mess is yours to own. She turned and departed. The ballroom's chatter did not resume for some time. Shaw remained. He gazed at his brother, not with anger, but with a shared sense of hopelessness. She has not yet begun to weep, Shaw said quietly. When she does, it will be absolutely finished. Then he too is gone. Garrett stood alone in the heart of the gala. Monique was beside him, but a vast chasm had opened between them in 5 minutes. A wine glass was forgotten in his hand, and he began to truly grasp the meaning of forever. The partners acted with a swiftness Garrett had completely misjudged. In 1 week of receiving Leona's file, 3 allied families seized the Lincoln Park project. These men played percentages, not with their hearts. A forged signature was not an error. It was a felony that could sink their entire enterprise. Exposure was a risk their world would not abide. Their attorneys launched a sweeping audit of every transaction Garrett had greenlit in the past 3 years. Garrett hired a lawyer, then another, after the first reviewed the file and said he was irreparably doomed. Garrett understood the subtext. In legal terms, exceptionally grim means it is finished. As the Callaway empire collapsed, Monique Voss took up residence in the Gold Coast penthouse. She appeared 3 days after Leona left, with 2 suitcases and the air of a victor. She filled Leona's vacant closet, used the vanity Leona had designed, and sat on the sofa Leona had chosen. For a few hours, it felt like a conquest. Then the feeling evaporated. The Garrett she knew, the smooth dealmaker, the rising star, was gone. This man took his calls from behind a locked bathroom door, his voice a muffled drone she could not decipher. This man consumed his meals in total silence, the scrape of his fork the only sound. His gaze no longer met hers. It passed straight through her to some distant place she could never reach. This man flinched when his phone buzzed from an unknown number. Not the reflex of a busy executive, but of someone anticipating a detonation. And the bomb always calls from a number you do not know. Monique had truly believed she had claimed the ultimate prize. She quickly learned she had merely boarded a vessel that was going down. She remained for 2 weeks, as the quiet in that penthouse grew heavier by the day. This was not the comfortable silence of intimacy. It was the sound of a foundation cracking, of pressure escaping. Garrett gave no affection, no conversation about a future, only terse instructions about his schedule. On the 12th night, Monique finally called her father, Conrad Voss. Her words were sparse, or perhaps there were many too faint to register. The following morning, she began to pack. She even folded the red dress she had worn on arrival. She laid the dress in her suitcase, a final assertion of control, or perhaps one last bitter parting shot. As she left, she tore a sheet from Leona's notepad and wrote in a quick, sharp hand, "My mistake. A poor calculation." That evening, Garrett came home and read the note 3 times. He called Shaw, who answered on the 5th ring. "She left," Garrett said, his voice flat. "I know," Shaw said. "The partners," Garrett started. "I know, Garrett." A beat of silence. How is Mom? She is stable, Shaw answered. She is continuing to function. She broke down once, the night of the gala, alone in her room. I heard it from the hallway. She didn't know I was there. Shaw paused. The silence that came after was more profound than any words he had spoken. I have never heard a sound like that from her. Not even when Dad died did she mourn with such a terrible force. The quiet that followed was the longest of the call. When Garrett spoke again, his voice was fractured. The confident Alpha was gone. All that remained was the sound of the man standing in the wreckage he himself had built. I need some help, Garrett finally confessed, a plea that was met by Shaw's cold dose of reality. I am aware, he replied, before defining the issue as an incurable illness, a burden Garrett would now bear alone. His words were not cruel, just a statement of brutal fact. The final harsh kindness a younger brother offers an older one when solace is useless. This absence of malice gave the verdict a terrible weight, far deeper than any blame. The physical proof of this new reality was a second-floor unit in a Pilsen brick building on 18th Street. A drive of under 15 minutes from the penthouse, it was another universe entirely. Leona had acquired this refuge nearly 2 years prior, a hidden purchase funded by an account Fritz Harmon had helped her establish. For 18 months, her life had been migrating there, piece by piece, concealed by Garrett's travels or his simple failure to notice. Because the delicate details of her soul had faded from his view long ago, her new life was a study in stark utility. 1 bedroom, a kitchen bleeding into the living space, and windows that stared into a brick alley. The sparseness of her furniture wasn't born of poverty, but from a soul weary of beauty, seeking only purpose now. A simple gray sofa, a rough-hewn wooden table, and curtains of her own making. For those who could read Leona's heart, they were not meant to hide her from the world, but to wall it out. Dot Marsh appeared 2 weeks after Leona had vanished. Arriving by cab from the suburbs, she ascended the stairs, ignoring the silent protest of her knees, a pain sharper this year than the last. The door swung open, but no embrace was offered. Dot entered and began a deliberate circuit of the room, her gaze cataloging the sparse furnishings. With the unerring sense of a veteran seamstress, her fingers brushed the curtain fabric, a gesture that was at once a critique and an acknowledgement. She absorbed the room's stark preparedness, its quiet hum of imminent conflict. Finally, her judgment came. This kind of preparation is done long before the first shot is fired. You're the one who taught me to be ready, Leona retorted. Dot settled into the lone armchair, her gaze locked on her daughter, her expression devoid of triumph or the relief of a mother whose child had evaded danger. Her face held something far more complicated, a fusion of deep-seated bitterness and an unbreakable love. It was the expression of an architect gazing upon the weapon she had forged from her own daughter, finally understanding its terrible price. The silent years of strategy, the profound solitude of a protracted campaign, and the singular pain of a triumph that demanded the immolation of a world she once held true. Are you grieving? Dot inquired. Leona approached the question with clinical detachment, dissecting her emotions to find the core truth. I am, she finally answered. Not for what I have lost, but for the faith I once had in what it was supposed to be. That is the one loss that truly deserves our tears, Dot affirmed. They remained in silence as twilight descended, the maple tree's shadow elongating across the room as if trying to hold them. No more words were necessary. grief has its own language. The creator and the creation can share a stillness, a single breath, and find it sufficient. But so much of the narrative remained untold. The truth was splintered between two other men whose testimonies were now due. Shaw Calloway held a fragment of the tale. Perry Hayes possessed it all, and the secret they guarded for 2 years held the key to reinterpreting everything from a phone on a desk to the very shape of Leona's smile in that high-rise home. 20 months prior, with Garrett cloistered in his study poring over fiscal statements, Perry Hayes entered and placed an envelope on the gleaming desk. It contained 12 photographs. Leona lingering in a shop. Leona at her preferred cafe clutching a cup of coffee. Leona emerging from a florist. Leona cruising along Lakeshore Drive. Each image was captured from a unique vantage point, with a different lens, on a separate day. Time and location were stamped in the corner with the chilling exactitude of an intelligence dossier. The final picture was not of Leona. It was of Dot Marsh before her textile studio, posture erect, a bolt of cloth in her arms, utterly oblivious to the unseen eye that watched her. Accompanying the pictures was a note, its flawless script presenting a demand so stark it held Garrett motionless for 5 entire minutes. The communique was from Conrad Voss. It was no theatrical menace, but a calm, corporate edict of war. He proposed a merger, a civilized term for the utter absorption and erasure of the Calloway Empire, its influence, and its legacy. The other option was an assurance that Conrad would replicate the fate of Thomas Calloway. Only this time, the target would be the one soul Garrett valued above all else. Garrett understood the gravity. Voss had orchestrated the downfall of his own father. The photographs were undeniable evidence. Voss had been tracking Leona for weeks, charting her patterns, her travels, and her mother's whereabouts. Garrett remained in his office until 3 a.m, by which time he had conceived a counteroffensive. His strategy required the methodical annihilation of his most precious human connection in order to preserve it. Garrett was to become the monster in her story. The reasoning was barbaric yet astute. Leona's love made her a vulnerability. The illusion of her hatred would render her useless as a pawn, and in that uselessness, she would find her sanctuary from Conrad Voss. Every late night in that office was merely one scene in a much larger production. Each time his phone lay screen down, it concealed war room calls with Perry, not an affair. His methodical detachment and feigned indifference were precise maneuvers designed to slowly corrode their bond. The ultimate goal was to have her leave of her own volition, ensuring the separation appeared entirely genuine and aroused no suspicion from Conrad. The unfamiliar perfume was just stagecraft. Monique Voss was never the other woman. She was a gambit. Conrad's own child, drawn into Garrett's orbit to serve as an inside source, feeding her father a fabricated narrative of a man coming undone. Concurrently, Perry Hayes was in contact with federal agents, assembling a formidable case against the Voss Syndicate's criminal enterprises. The signature Leona discovered was not from a theft. Garrett had placed it there himself within a fabricated transaction, a piece of bait for Voss's network. The authentic financial records were protected, ensuring Leona remained untainted. The forgery was engineered to entice Voss to co-sign a guarantee tying his foreign assets to a federal money laundering probe. When she exposed it, Leona unwittingly alerted Voss that his strategy had failed, compelling him into a desperate, premature assault. In her blindness, she had just dismantled Garrett's 2-year gambit. using the very intelligence he had always cherished in her. The true catastrophe was not the collapse of the plan, but the private torment he endured night after night. Shaw knew because the weight was too much for Perry to bear alone. So many times after the covert calls were done, Garrett would linger in his office at 3 a.m., call up their wedding photos on his phone, and lose himself in a single image of Leona's smile. He would gaze at her face, kissed by sunlight, a smile founded on a faith he was now methodically engineered to annihilate. Then he would extinguish the screen, turn the phone over, and resume his work. Perry witnessed this ritual time and again. One night, huddled with Shaw against the harsh Chicago wind, Perry confessed the truth. For 2 years, your brother has been decaying internally, not from his foe's attacks, but from the pain of letting her think his love had died. He's been held captive by silence. The cruelest prison is the one constructed from those you are trying to save. The instant Monique departed the penthouse, Conrad Voss lost his primary informant within the Callaway fortress, and within 48 hours of the altered file circulating, Conrad understood the snare had never been intended for Garrett. All along, Garrett had been weaving his own. The apparent vulnerability, the infidelity, the fixation on Monique, the entire 2-year performance was an intricate, flawlessly managed deception. Conrad Voss did not suffer being made a fool. 10 years ago, he had arranged Thomas Callaway's death and slept soundly. The realization that he had been so thoroughly outplayed by Thomas's son, with his own daughter as the instrument, stirred no remorse, only a frigid, visceral fury that demanded a violent outlet. Conrad initiated his retaliation on a Thursday, 3 days after Monique's departure, launching a coordinated 2-pronged attack. The primary crew was dispatched to the Gold Coast residence to eliminate Garrett. A secondary crew headed for the south side to the 3rd-story flat of Dot Marsh. In Conrad's mind, an attack on the mother was an attack on the daughter, and a blow to the former wife was a wound to the husband. Certain bonds are not severed by legal documents. Perry Hayes's prescience was their salvation. He had breached Voss's communications 8 months prior, and that tenuous connection afforded them a 40-minute warning before the teams mobilized. 40 minutes. In their world, 40 minutes can be a lifetime. A command shot from Perry to Garrett, then to Shaw. 2 calls, each less than 60 seconds, containing only directives. Shaw's task was to retrieve Dot from the south side and Patricia from Lincoln Park without delay. Inquiry was a privilege they couldn't afford. Living was not. He completed the task in 20 minutes with a skill forged in the fires of past trauma. It was their way. Move first, understand later, if at all. Garrett, for his part, chose aggression over evasion, forsaking the sanctuary of his high-rise home. With Perry and 4 associates, he advanced on Conrad's command center. It was a derelict warehouse near the water, thick with the stench of the lake, corrosion, and oil. This was no suicidal impulse. It was the final play in his long game. If Conrad survived, the danger would be perpetual. But if Garrett fell, Leona would be secure. Her legal detachment from the Callaway name rendered her strategically irrelevant to Conrad, a man who never expended assets on a target with no value. 11 minutes. That's all it took for the warehouse to become a slaughterhouse, a maelstrom of violence so chaotic that memory itself recoiled. 3 minutes in, lead tore through Perry's left shoulder. He fell to his knees and kept firing with his right hand. By the 7th minute, a slug ripped into Garrett's left side. As he collapsed onto the concrete, reality began to fray. stretching into that strange, syrupy timeline of trauma, a slow-motion descent into a living nightmare. As consciousness faded, Garrett's world dissolved into mist. His company, his wealth, Conrad Voss himself, all of it became meaningless. His 2-year crusade was now nothing but ash. Only Leona remained, not the phantom of her smile on their wedding day, but the cool, deliberate curve of her lips as she took the divorce papers from his hand. It was the smirk of a victor, utterly convinced the war was won. In her triumph, he felt the crushing weight of his own defeat, not the war with Voss, but the psychological one he had waged to save her by meticulously earning her hatred. That smile was the most profound wound Garrett Calloway had ever inflicted upon himself, a masterpiece of pain sculpted over 18 months of calculated cruelty and a single soul-crushing lie. Bleeding out on the warehouse floor, he knew his death would forever cement that expression as her final memory of him. She would live on, absolutely certain of her judgment, never knowing he was dying because he'd chosen her safety over everything else. Conrad Voss fell at the 9-minute mark, not by Garrett's hand, but by Perry's last bullet, fired from his knees. 2 minutes later, the warehouse filled with the silent, flashing lights of federal cruisers. Their appearance was a wild card, a contingency rendered useless by Leona's intel leak. The night's carnage had sparked an unforeseen chain of events. Gunfire reported by neighbors brought local police, who, assessing the war zone, called in federal backup. Inside, agents found all the evidence needed to utterly demolish the Voss organization. The empire collapsed that night, not from a meticulous 2-year plan, but in a chaotic spray of gunfire and bad decisions. The way these stories almost always end. Garrett lay perfectly still on the cold concrete. The bleeding from his wound began to subside as his body waged a desperate, failing war to survive. As medics drew closer, he gazed at the steel rafters above, seeing only an endless black void. His last coherent thought was not of his own mortality, but a single, agonizing question. Would she ever know the truth? At 2:17 in the morning, the call was placed. Leona was awake in her Pilsen apartment, engaged in her nightly ritual of staring at the ceiling. This wasn't stress, it was the slow, methodical way the darkness dismantled the armor she wore by day. Her phone vibrated, illuminating the screen with Shaw's name. Leona answered for one reason. Shaw had never called her, not once in 4 years. Garrett was always the conduit. A direct call from him at this ungodly hour was a blaring siren, signaling a crisis that could not wait for dawn. The tremor in Shaw's voice sent her bolting upright. It wasn't his words, but the profound instability beneath them. Shaw Calloway was a man forged from pure composure, for that calm to shatter their entire world had to be coming apart at the seams. Northwestern Memorial, he said, now. The 12-minute drive to the hospital is a void in her memory. She doesn't recall seeing a single light. She has no recollection of making a single turn. Her universe shrank to her knuckles, white on the steering wheel and the wild, frantic pulse hammering in her throat. Shaw was waiting in the emergency room, his face a bloodless, haunted mask. What first appeared as a dark smudge on his sleeve sharpened into the unmistakable stain of blood as she approached. His update was brutally efficient. Garrett was in surgery. Perry needed to see her. He then led her to Perry Hayes's room. A thick dressing covered Perry's left shoulder, and he was pale from blood loss, but his eyes were sharp with the clarity of a man about to unburden his soul. Perry saw Leona in the doorway and wasted no time on pleasantries. He didn't ask how she was. He simply began to speak. He started at the very beginning. The 12 photographs, the plain manila envelope that appeared on Garrett's desk 2 years ago, the ultimatum delivered by Conrad Voss. He laid out each fact with cold, chronological precision, devoid of any emotional flourish. Perry understood that a truth this devastating needed no adornment. With every word he spoke, another fissure cracked the foundation of Leona's reality. Garrett's affair was a fabrication, a meticulously staged play. That was the first fracture. His nightly distance and evasions were not neglect. They were the bricks and mortar of a wall he was building to protect her. The second revelation: Monique was not his lover but his informant. Garrett used Conrad's own daughter to feed him intel, all while playing the part of the reckless fool Voss needed him to be. The third bombshell, the forged signature Leona found, was the final piece of the trap meant for Voss. By exposing it, she had single-handedly detonated Garrett's entire 2-year plan, a plan for which he had sacrificed his marriage, his wife's faith, and now, himself. "And every night he acted like a ghost to you," Perry said, his voice raw with something far deeper than exhaustion. "He was dying inside, not at the hands of Voss, but from the hell of watching you believe he'd stopped loving you, while being powerless to say a word." Leona stood frozen under the harsh institutional lights, and for the first time since the nightmare began, the receipt, the warning, the forgery, that victorious smirk she'd given Garrett, for the very first time, Leona shattered completely. This was not the silent fall of tears. This was not the controlled, performative grief her mother, Dot Marsh, had taught her. She broke like a building imploding, its internal structure failing before the facade could crumble. The sound of her raw agony tore through the sterile hallway at 3 a.m. A nearby nurse heard it and simply looked down at her work, knowing some wounds cannot be sutured, they can only be broken open. She wept for weaponizing her every gift, her intellect, her courage, her will, to annihilate the one man trying to save her, a guided missile targeting its own home base. Patricia Calloway descended on the hospital at 4 a.m. Shaw had made the call. She strode down the corridor in a long coat, her eyes steady and dry, the expression of a woman who had shed her last public tear long ago. She found Leona a wreck in a plastic chair, eyes raw, hands clenched. She sat beside her. No hug, no soothing platitudes. Just this: "He wasn't trying to break you. He was trying to be the brace on the other side." Leona met her mother-in-law's gaze, and for the first time in 4 years, they were not rivals, but two women, one on the verge of losing a son, the other a husband, trapped in the same circle of hell. The doctor finally allowed Leona inside at 5 a.m. Garrett was a landscape of tubes and monitors, lost to the world. The machine beside him blinked with numbers Leona didn't understand, but their steady rhythm was the beat of his survival. She sat and took his hand, the one from their wedding, the one that accepted the divorce decree, the one that forged a signature to save her. And she began to talk. She confessed everything. Every call to Fritz, every secret maneuver, every night she spent in the guest room, cultivating a cold, methodical hatred for him, a rage that could only be born from the deepest love. She owed him a truth as monumental as his lie. Then she spoke the words that would haunt her for the rest of her days. "I was so focused on being strong, I failed to see that you were the one drowning." Dot arrived with the dawn. She didn't ask for the story. The sight of her daughter at his bedside, holding the unconscious man's hand, told her everything she needed to know. She simply pulled up a chair and sat in silence, her presence the only comfort she could offer. Sometimes the greatest act of power isn't to fix the damage, but to simply bear witness to the wreckage. Garrett Calloway woke on the third day after his surgery. He surfaced into a blast of clinical light and the metronome of a machine. The third thing he registered was a hand holding his. He slowly turned his head and saw Leona, slumped in the chair, her eyes bruised with exhaustion, wearing a faded gray sweater from the life they had annihilated. Her expression was alien to him, not the cold strategist, not the ice queen of the last 18 months, but the hollowed-out gaze of someone who had cried themselves empty. They sat in a vast, dead silence, the kind that exists only in the crater left by mutual destruction, where words are too small for the damage yet too heavy for the air. Garrett's voice was a ruined whisper, each word an immense effort. He croaked that her smile, on the day of their separation, had struck him harder than any bullet. Leona's grip on his hand tightened, a visceral response born of their shared trauma. "I thought you were letting us go," she breathed, her voice thick with the raw fear of abandonment. Garrett, depleted by a 3-day coma and catastrophic blood loss, let a different man surface, a more vulnerable version she hadn't seen in years. "I let go of everything," he said, "except you." It was a masterful stroke, reframing his own survival as a sacrifice for her. Mending this was not one moment, but a brutal, ugly renegotiation, built from sessions where all the poison they had stored was finally painfully drawn out. For 18 months, a lie festered between them, followed by a ruinous silence. They volleyed blame, each wrapped in their own tragic, self-serving narrative. The truth of their wreckage is this: it wasn't one act to forgive, but a collision of selfish histories that nearly destroyed them both. Patricia, the matriarch, arrived in his second week of healing. She was forged steel, her expression a cold calculus of maternal fear. She offered no comfort, only a strategy. "You must trust her with the truth. A woman who withstands your treachery is more than prepared for your war," she concluded, her assessment of Leona's resilience chillingly precise. Garrett's sharp nod was an oath heavier than any he had ever uttered. He was blind to the drama unfolding in the corridor, where Dot Marsh and Patricia Calloway faced each other for the first time in 4 years. One, a Southside tailor, the other, a Lincoln Park mob widow. The chasm between their worlds was vast, yet a silent understanding bridged it instantly. Their bond was primal, forged in the solitary fires of raising sons in a brutal world, and sharpened by the shared terror of almost losing them. Dot's voice was the first to break the silence. "Our boys are stubborn." A ghost of a smile, a true rarity, touched Patricia's lips in quiet assent. "A trait they inherit from us," she replied. In that sterile hall, an unspoken pact was sealed between two queens, their separate worlds merging into a single, profound moment. A year on, Leona and Garrett inhabited a Pilsen flat, a lifetime away from their Gold Coast fortress, their existence intentionally scaled down. Their new view on 18th Street was of a lone maple tree. Its fresh leaves after a brutal winter were a quiet symbol of their new life, smaller, simpler, truer. Leona rebuilt her company, securing 2 new clients and reclaiming her autonomy piece by piece. This wasn't about money, it was about breathing her own air again after nearly suffocating. It was a move of power, not the desperate scramble she knew at 23. Garrett ceded control of the Calloway empire to Shaw. the man who had covertly managed it for 4 years. Shaw began the painstaking work of legitimizing the enterprise, a cleansing Garrett a man made for conflict could never achieve. Perry Hayes, his second in command, carried a permanent limp in his left shoulder, a physical testament to his loyalty. One afternoon, as Leona hung curtains she had sewn, Garrett watched her, hands buried in his pockets. "It isn't straight," he observed. The words were more than a comment. They were a subtle, probing test for control. Leona turned, her smile no longer the defensive armor of their penthouse life, but a new, softer shield, a way to diffuse his casual cruelties before they could ignite another war. "Nothing truly beautiful is ever perfect," she countered, reshaping their entire reality to create a space for him within it. The laugh that escaped him was only the second genuine one she had ever heard from his lips. The first had been 4 years prior, inside a West Loop gallery. Between those two sounds lay a desolate landscape of trauma, bloodshed, and near-fatal encounters. On their kitchen table, in the very space where divorce papers once lay like a declaration of war, now rested a different document. Not a weapon, but a sonogram. The positive result, sitting beside a coffee cup, marked the start of a new era. Garrett prepared that coffee for her each day, a small, silent ritual of care, a language of devotion he was slowly mastering in place of grand, hollow vows. And every morning, her acceptance of it was a conscious choice to forgive him anew, not once, but perpetually. Perhaps this was the only path forward for two souls so deeply fractured. But a final caution: never mistake a broken woman's silence for surrender. She is forever watching, and never confuse a possessive man's calm for peace. His hunt has never truly ended. And so concludes their turbulent saga. But I ask you, what is your judgment on the destructive orbit of Leona and Garrett? Have you ever witnessed silence inflict deeper wounds than an open conflict, or seen deception used as a shield for a painful truth? The fatal flaw was not their actions, but their utter inability to communicate. Leave your insights in the comments below. I wish to read them all. If this story resonated with you, honor it with a like, share it with your circle, and subscribe for your daily immersion into the human heart. Until we meet again, stay vigilant and navigate your own stories with care. This chapter is now closed. I will return with another tale unearthed from the city's shadows.
Everybody was smart, everybody was loving, everybody still almost ruined everything. This is the kind of story that hurts because nobody gets to be comfortably stupid. That is what makes it dangerous. If Garrett were just a cheating monster, easy. If Leona were just a paranoid wife, easy. If Monique were only a cartoon villain in a red dress, easy. But no, this story refuses to give the audience that luxury. Instead, it hands them a much nastier truth. Sometimes two people can love each other for real and still wreck each other because they chose pride, silence, and strategy at the exact moments they should have chosen truth. Let's start with Leona because her side is painfully understandable. She sees the signs. Garrett gets colder. The phone goes face down. He comes home later and later. He stops asking about the work that once made her feel visible. Then there is the hotel receipt, and after that, the friend confirms seeing him with another woman. On top of all that, she discovers financial documents with her signature forged onto them. At that point, from her perspective, this is not a marriage in trouble. This is a controlled demolition already in progress. And here's the thing, she reacts brilliantly. She does not turn into chaos, she turns into precision. Lawyer, paperwork, transfers, quiet planning. She becomes one of those people who look calm enough to fool a room while quietly removing every brick from the foundation. That is why audiences root for her. She does not just survive betrayal, she outgrows the need to collapse in front of it. Life lesson number 1 lands right there. Pain does not always make a person weaker. Sometimes it makes them organized in terrifying ways. Then Garrett walks into the penthouse with divorce papers and Monique at his side like he is directing the scene and Leona is supposed to play the broken wife. Bad move. Horrible read. Leona smiles, opens a drawer and pulls out her own folder. Suddenly, the script changes. She has already signed her version, already moved the money, already protected what is hers, already sent his forged signature mess to the people most capable of wrecking his life. Garrett is standing there thinking he has the final word, and meanwhile, she's been editing the ending for 18 months. That scene is addictive because it delivers a fantasy many viewers secretly crave. The fantasy that betrayal will someday meet a person too prepared to bleed in public. But then the story does something cruel. It makes that fantasy incomplete. Because Garrett was not cheating. That is the second the emotional ground drops out from under everyone. He was performing betrayal to protect Leona from an external threat. He knew enemies were tracking her. He knew she could be used against him, so he decided that the safest version of Leona was one who hated him and had left him. He made himself look faithless on purpose. Now here is why that hurts so badly. The audience has to admit that Garrett's motive was love, but his method was poison. He loved her enough to be hated by her. That sounds noble for 5 seconds until the brain catches up and says, wait, he still let her live in emotional hell for 2 years. Exactly, that is the problem. He was protecting her body while wrecking her reality. He was deciding for her what kind of pain she should be allowed to feel. He turned himself into a villain because he believed secrecy was safer than partnership. Life lesson number 2, good intentions do not cancel the damage caused by control. Garrett's biggest flaw was not that he loved too little. It was that he loved in a way that removed Leona's right to know the truth about her own life. That is not protection in its pure form. That is protection contaminated by ego and fear. He believed only he could carry the burden. He believed truth would endanger her more than deception. He made himself the sole author of reality. That is where love starts slipping into arrogance. Now flip back to Leona. Was she wrong? Emotionally, no. Ethically, not in any easy sense. She followed the evidence any reasonable person would follow, but her flaw is just as sharp. She was so committed to strength, to dignity, to never kneeling, that she stopped allowing for uncertainty. She did not ask one more question. She did not leave one crack open for the possibility that the story was bigger than the evidence on the surface. Her silence protected her pride, but it also locked her inside her interpretation. That is life lesson number 3. Strength without vulnerability can become another kind of blindness. And that is what makes this story more than melodrama. Both people are using survival skills that once served them well. Garrett learned to protect in silence. Leona learned to endure in silence. Those skills made them impressive. Those same skills almost buried them. Monique's role is fascinating too because she represents illusion. She thinks she is stepping into power. She sees a penthouse, a title, a legacy, and thinks she is won. But when Leona leaves and Monique moves in, the fantasy dies immediately. The man she wanted is not the man in the room anymore. He is haunted, distracted, hollowed out, bleeding stress through every silence. She thought she was inheriting a throne. She inherited a collapse. That is another lesson hiding in the story. People who chase someone else's life usually fall in love with the surface, not the structure. They want the house, not the history, the glamour, not the grief, the victory, not the cost. And the cost always comes due. Then the truth detonates fully. Leona learns Garrett never stopped loving her. She learns the affair was staged, the distance was intentional, the danger was real, and her own carefully planned counterattack accidentally shattered the larger operation he had built to protect her. By the time she reaches the hospital, her emotional certainty is dead. That is why her breakdown feels so raw. She is not just grieving Garrett, she is grieving the entire version of reality she had been living inside. This is where the story gets vicious in the best way. Because being betrayed gives a person a clear emotional role. There is anger, there is dignity, there is injury, there is direction, but discovering that the betrayal was actually a twisted form of love, that destroys the map. Now the villain is not a villain, the victim is not purely a victim, the revenge is not clean, the pain cannot be sorted into neat piles anymore. And that is life lesson number 4. Misunderstanding can do almost as much damage as malice, sometimes more. Why? Because malice at least makes emotional sense. Misunderstanding infects love itself. It makes every memory unstable. It forces the heart to revisit every cold glance, every quiet dinner, every sleepless night, and ask what it all meant. That kind of reinterpretation is brutal. Still, the story does not let either of them off the hook. Garrett nearly dies because the secret world he tried to control eventually explodes anyway. Leona nearly loses the man she loved because she had to protect herself from the man she thought he was. Both were sincere. Both were intelligent. Both were wrong in the ways that mattered most. That is why the ending works only because it gets smaller. No triumphant return to status, no giant fantasy reset, just a simpler home. Rebuilt routines, real conversations, handmade curtains, morning coffee, a baby on the way. Not because life magically became pure, but because both of them finally learned that love cannot survive indefinitely as performance. And here comes the last lesson, the one that lingers the longest. The most dangerous kind of silence is not the silence of hatred. It is the silence of love trying to be clever. Hatred announces itself. Love in disguise destroys from inside. Garrett thought silence would save her. Leona thought silence would protect her dignity. Both were wrong. So in the end, what broke them was not a lack of feeling. It was the belief that feeling could survive without truth, that the relationship could carry secrets as heavy as fear, danger, betrayal, pride, and identity and still remain alive underneath all that weight. It could not. It almost died. And that is why this story stays with people. Not because somebody cheated, not because the twist was shocking, not because the Mafia backdrop made it dramatic. It stays because it tells an uglier, more useful truth. Two people can stand in the same house, love each other deeply, and still become strangers if both of them keep choosing silence over clarity. Everybody in this story lost something. Garrett lost the right to be understood. Leona lost the safety of certainty. Monique lost the fantasy she chased. Even the families lost the illusion that control can protect love. But the ones who survive learn the only lesson that matters. If love has to hide the truth to survive, then it is already halfway to collapse.